name is Janet Tran, and I have the privilege of serving as the director of the Center for Civics, Education, and Opportunity at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Thanks so much for tuning in today. I am extremely excited for our conversation, which I hope can provide some insight for educators, parents, and learners alike. So before we begin, I'd like to pay tribute to one of my sheroes, an inspiration to so many who organized Civic Learning Week, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. President Ronald Reagan, upon nominating her, described her as a person for all seasons, possessing the unique qualities of temperament, fairness, intellectual capacity, and devotion to the public good. President Joe Biden, upon her passing, reflected that he admired her decency and unwavering devotion to the facts, to our country, to active citizenship, and the common good. She would have turned 94 years old on March 26th, and I know Civic Learning Week is the perfect way to celebrate the legacy of the first woman on the Supreme Court of the United States. Because before and in between those official presidential statements, Justice O'Connor embodied the life of an active citizen. And of course, there can be overlap in active and activist civic engagement, but I think our audience here is tuned in today because with all of the noise, it's getting much harder to discern what is appropriate to teach, what's appropriate to encourage, and to cultivate. From our educators and civic learning providers, we hear that they feel ill-prepared or nervous about the repercussions of appearing political. And only 1 in 5 social studies teachers in the U.S., in U.S. public schools, only 1 in 5 feel very prepared to support student civic learning, according to the RAND Corporation survey. From our parents and families, they express feeling basically just shut out of their students' education, and they want to ensure that the values are coming from them and from the home. According to polling from the Jack Miller Center, 71% of parents believe their child is not receiving an honest picture of American history education. So this distrust, it's creating a chilling effect across our nation's schools. And I think what's resulting is people are just deciding we're not going to teach any civic learning. And it's pockets of civic learning that are happening around the country. So we want to get to the bottom of what the key distinctions are so our audience can be better consumers and educators of civic learning in civic education. So I want to extend my deep gratitude to our panelists today who joined this critical conversation in spite of the potential of being canceled for their responses. So no pressure, but welcome Dr. Ashley Bernard, the director of Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy, Brene Green, the CEO of the Mikveh Challenge, and Chris Riano, president of the Center for Civic Education. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Janet.
Of course. Ashley, I think we're going to start with you since you think about civic learning and engagement from a really macro perspective at your center at Johns Hopkins University. If you wouldn't mind, from your vantage point, sharing what you think the key distinctions are between active and activist citizenship.
So, great question. I think when political scientists and theorists think about what is successful civic formation of young people, generally they're looking at 4 outcomes. They're looking at political knowledge, not just knowledge of the US political system, but knowledge of other systems, of history, of literature, of philosophy and geography, all the things that make us able to have good judgment about foreign policy. So it's the political knowledge, the political skills, the civic skills of interpreting graphs, reading and writing well, being able to articulate your views to your congressperson, for example. Number 3 is the dispositions and habit of engagement and involvement in the community. And number 4, it is the very difficult but absolutely critical capacity for civil tolerance, meaning not anything goes, but the ability to hear, disagree with respect those with whom you engage. So it's all those four capacities. And I think when we look at what democracies and democratic school systems are really tasked with, it's those four capacities. And we can't control whether or not students grow up to be active citizens and engaged in all the ways we hope, but those are the four kind of planks that we know can get them there. Now, activism I think of as, an is having those capacities and turning them in a particular cause, political party, political platform, something that matters to you as an individual. So really it could be your passion could be for gun control, your passion could be for, international politics to go a certain way, or a political party. Those kinds of single-minded focus in a direction that is politically attuned and specific to a cause, that's what I think of as being activism. And of course those are not mutually exclusive. You have to be a really savvy activist, you have to know all those things and have all those capacities. I think that where we get a little bit confused sometimes and upset is when schools are meant to impart these four core capacities and not necessarily channel kids in a particular ideological direction. There's a lot of confusion in our country about those two right now.
Well, those four capacities don't sound too scary, but let's get a little more granular. Chris and Vernay, your organizations are civic learning and engagement providers. And I would love for you to give us examples of active citizenship and what that looks like in your capacity and how that can be learned. And conversely, share what activist citizenship looks like instead to you. Starting?
I'll start very quickly and briefly. This conversation to me is very much grounded in some of what I would think of as the fundamentals of our actually shared American experience. In this kind of thought process, come back to one of our more interesting and studied American philosophers, Tocqueville, right, who came to this nation, wrote a book, and talked about the uniqueness of actually this very topic. The fact that in what he saw I think he wrote in the 1830s, if I remember, what he saw was that there was this very unique American idea that we associate, that civilly we come together, we look at issues in our community, and we find ways to associate to address those issues. And one of the things that I come back to when I think about this, and it really does come at any age in our society, is that through that association, I would think Tocqueville would say, we find commonality through working through our differences and things that we don't necessarily agree on. And there's something very unique about bringing to the table different viewpoints, different ideas, but yet having maybe I'll use the term intellectual humility to work together to address what we see as an issue at a local level. For the moment, I'm thinking local. And I always come back to that because I think one of the things that we have to do, again, at any age, is to give people the toolkit of our history, to give people the toolkit of how our civil arc and constitutional arc got us to today. But then I do think it's important to then use that toolkit to continue to engage in our communities. And one of my favorite things to say to a learner of any age is, it's very important to serve on a jury. It's very important to vote. But I want to know what you do the other 364 days a year. I want to know if you are working in a community garden. I want to know if you're working in some sort of civic organization. I think those things matter. And I come back to that because I think that when we think about a very important part of the American experience is being an engaged part of our society. And our society, in many ways, the way that it's designed requires that engagement.
It's all local, right?
Local matters. There's no way to escape that. Local matters.
Well, Vernay, what are your thoughts here?
Sure. Just thanking you for opening up this discussion and allowing us to have this really important conversation. Our mission at MICVA Challenge is to develop young people to be, and I'm reading our mission statement, empowered, informed, and active civic leaders who will promote a just and equitable society. Active is part of what we are aspiring to do. We want to train young people to be future civic leaders and really care and be concerned about their communities. You talked about local government, but also about bigger picture, what is happening nationally as well as globally. That where that activism comes in, and we talked about this prior to jumping on this call, and even at the beginning of this conversation, that activism can have a negative connotation, but really activists are people who are trying to attach a solution to a problem that they are facing. And so, yes, they are engaged, and Chris gave some really great examples around civic engagement, but part of our work really asks young people to name the problem, a problem that they see, an issue that's really important to them, and what would they do about that? So really attaching a solution to that problem. And that is what is being, labeled in many spaces as being activists, which I'm okay with. It is problem solvers, it is thinkers, really critically looking at the world that we're in, and the solutions that they are finding really have, an impact beyond self. There is, literacy could be the problem. Many of our young people are talking about mental health. That is an issue, a problem that they are recognizing right now, and they are approaching that work locally, in their schools. Advocating for more school counselors is a form of action that many students are taking and pushing and saying, we know that this is what we need, and we need this right here in the building. So let me go to the decision maker in my space, because part of our work is really having them to understand, what are the power dynamics? Who is making this decision? If I'm saying change needs to happen, who is that source of change? And so I'm going to go to that source, and maybe it's my building principal. Maybe it is someone at the school district level, because this is a situation that impacts me as an individual as well as us collectively. So really, as we're looking at this work, two things. One, really encouraging young people to be engaged. We want them to be engaged early, because our belief is that if we engage them early, they will stay engaged for life, whether they are voting or whatever that, civic engagement activity, again, local, as far, as simple as community-based issues, and also that they are problem solvers, that they are solution finders in sort of this global living, that we do in this country and in this world, actually.
So I'm hearing there's a time and there's a place, but I think the $1 million question is, when and where is it appropriate for active and activist citizenship to take place, for each to happen, if you will? So, Ashley, do you mind if we go back to you? And I'll certainly want to hear Vernay and Chris for you to chime in as well.
Mm-hmm. So I used to teach comparative religion and ethics. My background is in history, and I study international education. And one of the things that's so interesting to me is the way that many of our democratic peers require exposure to diverse viewpoints as part of the educational system. So, for example, and they do this while funding very distinctive school communities, whether they be Jewish, Catholic, secular, socialist, Montessori, whatever. Most countries are pluralistic like this. So one of my favorite examples is the Netherlands, which funds 36 different kinds of schools on equal footing and hold them all accountable. But every single child across those schools has common content that they're exposed to, including comparative religion, ethics, diverse political viewpoints. As an extreme example, the Netherlands funds schools that are creationist, but every child in a creationist school has to demonstrate competent knowledge about evolutionary theory as part of being an informed citizen. And what I love about that approach is it kind of acculturates adults, parents, and kids to the fact that we can learn about things, we can be exposed to different ideas without feeling threatened by them. And I think that's what I wish for our country, that we were a little more comfortable writ large talking about ideas that we don't agree with, taking, we know from the data that kids do really well when they're doing mock legislative sessions or mock model United Nations, where they're kind of creating some distance between themselves and different ideas, but they're being exposed to different thought worlds. This is really important. And it's important for parents to understand that that is democratically and pedagogically important. I would see that as very different from a teacher presenting one side as though that is the only side.
That's a big paradigm shift for us, though.
Yes.
Renee, Chris?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. Just on the teachers presenting information, I think we also have to recognize young people are getting information from so many sources in this day. And so, we really work with our teachers to leverage our curriculum and help them to have critical conversations in their classroom. And that's a process. Professional development and coaching for teachers is huge for us. We're really excited to partner with schools and partner with districts in order to be able to support teachers to really create this platform to have critical conversations in classrooms, because those conversations are coming. Every young person right now has one of these. Oh, you just saw the picture of my kids as it flopped up. But every young person has a phone, and they are getting information constantly, incessantly. Information is being poured into them. And so what we really are, trying to create opportunities for teachers to, when you say like time and a place, it's really hard because they're getting that information and that information is coming. So really trying to create room for teachers to talk about the information that is coming to them. It's not teachers presenting a point of view. It is lots of points of view are coming. And so how do we create opportunities for teachers to be able to facilitate and help students manage meaning of the information that is coming at them? It's not just, I heard my mom voted this way, so I'm going to vote this way. Actually, I saw a TikTok about this issue, and then I saw another video about this issue. And so, good teaching, and I'm a former teacher, I believe good teaching is really facilitating those conversations so that multiple ideas are able to be shared and able to be experienced. And what I love about our work is that, we don't just partner directly with teachers. We try to work with school districts and school communities and provide that professional development and coaching, really helping teachers, one, have courageous conversations themselves, because we know as adults, we're not doing it well. We're not modeling it well for students, but also create spaces in their classrooms to have that courageous conversation, because we're battling this every day.
It's interesting because I come back to something, and I think this is my just historical and political background in teaching constitutional philosophy. And I was having a conversation with a student recently who was looking to have an impact in their community. We were talking through various questions, and I brought up Locke and Kant and Rousseau, and they started looking at me inquisitively, which I appreciated. And I say that because actually Locke, Kant, and Rousseau had some really interesting things they would say about the question that this person was asking about. And I mentioned that because I think that one of the things, especially at the center, but I think even more broadly, that we have to remember is that this is actually a much broader continuum. I think you have to give people the context of how we started this American experiment 250 years ago. I think that matters deeply because a lot of those things are still things that we're working through when it comes to the great balance of majority rule versus minority rights and how that functions in our country. I think you have to give the arc of how that's gone over the years and how it's changed over the years through constitutional amendment. But it's actually in Amendment number 1, we find the freedom to associate. There's a reason I think that's there in Amendment number 1. And I think there's a reason that philosophers like de Tocqueville thought that it was our civil society
Mhm.
that serves as a bulwark against government and to find solutions that are outside of just government solutions. And I think that that's an important thing to take away when you have the background and you
Yes.
have all the context and you then take that and you apply it to making change possible. And again, not to always ground in the text, but that is something that I tend to do. It does say in our preamble that we are all attempting to make a more perfect union. And I think that's possible when we do find ways to work
Promised
together.
perfect. We were just promised more perfect.
But I think what
Go
if I
ahead.
jump in, I think what Kirk was just saying about the rich background that we want our young people to have. We don't want slogan slinging. We don't want, well, I think X. We want that eventually, but we really want there to be a real appreciation, not just for our country, but for like the unbelievable likelihood that it would happen in the first place. You know, the what does it look like in a tyranny? You know, what is it like to live behind, what was it like behind the Iron Curtain? You know, all of these things matter. And that's, I think that's a problem in our country because we have for 100 years, we walked away from kind of, for want of a better word, a liberal arts approach to education that by definition includes multiple perspectives, that includes wide look at the human experience and also creates those shared connections. And, you know, to Renee's point about the courageous conversations, it's nothing new that we have not been having these conversations. The data from classroom conversations where kids are given viewpoint diversity and teachers present multiple perspectives, there have been very few studies of our country in the last 20 years in our capacity to do this, but it's about 5% of the classrooms have that built in. It is learned behavior. And so what Vernay said about teacher professional development is absolutely right. Giving administrators the language to say to parents, we're going to have these democratic deliberations as part of our pedagogical mission and so forth. It is all of these things matter.
Yeah, the dissent itself is not the problem. It's the how we've chosen to dissent seems to be what we're identifying here. I think, though, what concerns people and parents and families about teaching active citizenship is that maybe some educators somehow we have this profound influence, and we might be imparting whether we want to or not. Maybe it's just through our own biases that we're imparting partisanship and our partisan views on young people. So I don't know if you can respond to that and how you think we should be ensuring as best we can that teachers and educators and civic learning providers are being responsible about the influence we have, which is not as large as TikTok is what I'm hearing, but how can we be responsible with that influence?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the teacher training. It is really, having that training and exercise and practice of not sharing and not showing what your own political views are, because again, you're facilitating discussion, you are setting parameters for young people to think and think on their own, and that can be done as early as kindergarten.
Yes.
It does not have to be middle and high school students, and that's one of my concerns about sort of this debate. It is, we want people to think differently, we want people to drive change, but only when they're emotionally ready, or only when they're old enough to think for themselves. Every parent on this call knows that a 5-year-old can be really, really compelling when they want something and they've done their research, and they will tell you why that's the particular thing they want to eat for dinner that evening and why the other thing that you've proposed is not it. They're capable of doing more if we are giving them the conditions. Again, they have access to information. We're setting, opportunity for them. I do understand the concern. However, with the right preparation, and the research also shows that teachers are actually more scared to have these conversations. And so some of, I think, the concern, I won't say unfounded, but I will say it's exaggerated, because where teachers have gone, particularly post-COVID, is they've backed off. And you mentioned at the beginning of this call, Janet, the risk of being canceled. Teachers are scared. Schools have become spaces where you're scared for your job, so you won't have any conversation to avoid having hard conversations or avoid, taking a misstep. And that's actually a tragedy for our young people, that we've created this environment where teachers feel pressured and feel under attack unnecessarily. There are ways to step away. It does come with practice, just like setting up your classroom environment, takes practice to get it right. It does take practice to have courageous conversations and to sort of swallow your own personal and political views, because, we're egocentric, we're about selves, so how do we avoid doing that? It is the right training, and development. So I understand sort of where the argument is. To me, the solution is the investment.
And that's also background knowledge too. In our experience at the Institute, a lot of teachers did not have those kinds of Socratic conversations themselves. And they don't have they don't have the background knowledge to have to do what the Educating for American Democracy project helps with, right?
The second generation of high standardized testing of educators. So it is a whole paradigm shift. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so, as Renee said, giving teachers the capacity. And another thing is principals can do surveys, of our classrooms offering multiple perspectives? Are kids experiencing it that way? The International Civics and Citizenship Education Survey has had that question in their survey for 40 years. And the United States doesn't participate anymore in that. But our institute certainly has a school culture survey that asks those questions and can kind of give feedback of, oh, we're not having these conversations enough, or only certain populations in our schools are experiencing that kind of deliberation. How can we make it better?
Chris, we've talked a lot about why teachers are afraid to touch the subject. So, and I hear a lot of from folks who say, "Oh, I don't want my student to learn this. I don't want my child to learn that subject. I don't want my teacher talking to my child about this." But maybe we should take a moment here. I would love to hear from the three of you. What should students be actually learning as it pertains to civics from your vantage point?
I would say this. I think in many ways we're actually all saying something very similar, just maybe in different contexts. I think I do not hear frequently that folks don't want to make sure that people have a grounding in historical political philosophy, or grounding in the founding, or grounding in the 14th Amendment and how that came to be, or grounding in how that's transformed our society in many ways, or grounding in how the Bill of Rights really is a truly unique experience if you look historically at the way in which we've developed as a society, and that how that's changed over time, or an understanding of how there's an interplay between the executive and the legislature and the judiciary, or the fact that the federal government is a limited government, or the fact that by knowing some of the things we just talked about, we can come to an understanding of how to make our community better. I don't hear that often.
Won't get canceled for that, most likely.
I think that most people want their community to be better. I think at the end of the day, most people want to work together to find common ground, to find ways to make communities better. The thing that I've always taken away from this topic is I find far more commonality than difference. I just think that it's sometimes easier to focus on the difference than on the commonality. Mm-hmm. And yet it is through discussing the difference, finding the commonality, that we do continue to make progress. And I think that that's important, especially when you have a society that is as diverse as our society is, and will only become even more so.
Yeah, I've heard people say, we're only going to teach the founding documents, and that's all that young people need to know. However, couple things wrong with that. I won't say wrong with that, but there are a couple things wrong with stopping at the founding documents. For one, depending on the lived experience of the young person, their ethnicity, their background, when the founding documents were made, I was 3/5 of a person. And that's really, really hard to digest if you are saying only stick with the founding documents. Now, yes, there are amendments and other things that happen and other rights that were given. But for young people, again, who are critically looking at information and, documents, it's like, wait, what are you saying? Is that am I not relevant? I'm not prioritized, in this conversation. And then the relevant part is also important. Wanting to make sure that the information is real, is relevant, is applicable for young people. So, we spend a lot of time, in our process, and our work is very much a process. I do want to stress that it's a process. It is helping teachers to facilitate having young people understand how to research, how to examine an issue, how to take a position. And then if I've decided that some change needs to happen, I need to understand who has the ability to drive that change. So I need to know what the federal government does. Maybe my problem is a stoplight and I should not be writing my congressman about the issue that's a stoplight. I need to know who has the power to make change. Sometimes it's right here in my school. Janet, you said stories. I have an example of a young person I'm in Washington, D.C. right now, in D.C., who her issue was a problem that her principal was able to solve. We have a process where you name the important issue. There's a female identified student who said, my problem is that I have no access to menstrual products in my school. And in order to go to the bathroom and take care of my biological needs, I've got to ask help. It's embarrassing, all of these other reasons why that was the biggest problem. Her principal was sitting in the audience at that Project Soapbox event when she named that was her problem. And the next morning he found her and he was like, you know what? You named the biggest problem to you. I realized I could do something about that thing. Like I can help to make sure that we've stocked our bathrooms, that we talk to teachers about not asking for long explanations if a student needs to go to the restroom. I can solve your problem. And all of that who knows how long the young lady had been stressing about that very thing that she could do nothing about. However, not only did
It's
she
before her as well.
yes, and how she's now changed setting for so many young people in the school. And so for us, it's really helping them to identify as we teach civics, as we teach them about the role that we play in government, as they understand sort of the historical implications and why things were created in the way that they were created, what they as young people can do about it, what you have to navigate through, but also sort of what some of your options are, which then I will say that young lady whose principal solved her problem right away, she's going to keep identifying, she's going to keep talking, she's going to keep finding ways because she's realized the power of her own voice and her ability to drive change in this world. I won't even say this country, this world.
Yeah. A different on ramp, right? From falling in love with Locke or de Tocqueville to finding an issue and having that connection. So I'm going to move. Ashley, you alluded to it a little bit, but you've been thinking and writing a lot about this concept of exposure versus indoctrination. Ooh. And I don't want to say you preach it, but maybe if you wouldn't mind elaborating more and giving further examples than the schools in Netherlands and what that how we have become sort of prone to exposure versus indoctrination and maybe the misconceptions there.
Oh, sure. So, I mentioned earlier that the liberal arts curriculum, which many countries and school systems just democratize the liberal arts. So everyone is going to study higher math, everyone's going to study philosophy and literature. This should not be, I hasten to add, it shouldn't be the kind of dead white males approach. I'm talking about a more diverse, robust, inclusive conversation here, but the human experience across time and place and what we have in common, how we've suffered different ways, how we've suffered in the same ways, all of those things that ask the deeper questions of meaning and purpose and the good life and why we're here. And you can't have those kinds of conversations and access to that kind of literature without encountering very different ways of being in the world, very different notions of the good. And for many school systems and schools, this is baked in. And so I think because we haven't had that as an educational system for so long, for many parents who didn't have that themselves, their child comes home and says, I'm learning about X, and the parent experiences that as a threat. So we've worked with school systems in this country in which if a teacher talks about the 5 pillars of Islam, parents think that their kids being taught to be Muslim. And, there's those kinds of confusions, of course, you have to take seriously, but it's at the same time would be great to get past that, to get to the place where learning about something that is foreign to you is exciting and necessary and helps you understand the world better. And so I guess I will say, part of being in other countries and studying abroad and having my little kids with me in some of those school systems where everybody is learning the same kind of content, even if they're learning about it through different lenses, it's incredibly powerful. It creates connections across all kinds of difference of time and place. It's incredibly empowering for first generation kids.
Yeah, I think President Reagan in his farewell address said that it's not about learning the facts and the figures and the dates, but it was, quote, America's place in the world, which was a really deliberate wording. Obviously, any farewell address and presidential address takes a lot of thought and fine tuning. And it is, how do we know our place in the world if we don't know what's happening elsewhere and outside of our own small circle? So that was a helpful way of thinking about that.
And I will say, too, that parents, I know when I was teaching, I often had lots and lots of time with parents to talk about what the kids were learning. And in fact, one group of parents asked me to teach a course at night, the same stuff their kids were learning. And so, it's hard to have the bandwidth, but the parents, if you can bring parents along and say, these are really interesting conversations and include them, that can remove some of the threat, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Great. I'm going to move to Vernay. Your program is explicitly uses the term action civics, and I think Project Citizen, Chris, in the Center for Civic Education, may fall into that category as well. But not everyone is in love with this term, so I just want you to maybe explain why you think it's faced such backlash, and maybe where does action civics fall in the trajectory of active versus activist citizenship. So, please share your thinking about this and your responses perhaps to the critics.
Chris, you want to jump in or you want me to go?
Go for it.
Okay, sure. I mean, we use the word action civics and we use it proudly. As I read at the beginning, our mission says, we're training young people to be active. And in many examples and in many circles around, civic action and civic engagement, someone did something. It isn't that they were just reading something. They actually did something. Our tagline as an organization is that democracy is a verb. We firmly believe that you've got to take some action. And we believe that young people learn democracy by doing democracy. So Ashley talked about experiential experiences. If we think back to our own education, the lessons you remember the most are the times that you acted something out or you moved or you did something. It wasn't just sitting in a classroom. And I wish that I was a researcher, can tell you there's some data around like actually engaging in something versus being taught. So somebody more intelligent than me can pull those stats out. But we really firmly believe that if you've had the experience of practicing doing something, then you're engaging engaging in that long term. So we really stand by that. For example, we have our young people can serve as election judges, poll workers on election day, long before they're able to vote. So starting, at the age in Chicago and DC specifically, I believe it's 16, they're not eligible to vote yet, but they show up, they help people on election day, especially now that there's more technology with it. So they're able to, one, connect with voters, help them translate for people who, have language barriers, help them access the voting process. Those young people vote at higher rates because they've seen it happen. They've been engaged in the process. They've learned. If you are accustomed to talking about issues that you're really passionate about and concerned about at an elementary, middle, and high school level, then you go to college and you advocate for things, even for yourself. I don't understand something that's happening in the classroom, so I'm going to ask my teacher instead of sitting by passively and being confused in the classroom. I've learned a skill that is going to help me long term, and I firmly believe that the skills and dispositions that students are developing with us in elementary, middle, and high school will serve them, help them navigate through college and career, and will serve them for life. We firmly believe in that action piece of it, because there's data out there about experiential learning and how that helps young people to engage and to understand and process and even adopt skills. So I'll pause there.
I think one of the things that I think was great about this conversation, for many of those folks who are aware of the We the People program, we have units 1 through 6, but we at the center often think of Project Citizen as unit 7, putting it into practice.
Mm-hmm.
And most people here today, and many people who are joining us today, know we just today and tomorrow are having a major conference at Georgetown University, where we're revealing a research study that shows that by participating in research-backed, deep knowledge in a community, you can make a difference, and you can be more engaged, and you can be a part of solutions. And so what I want to come back to very briefly, and especially for something Vernay said, I love with my own students, not opening with, do you know who the president is, but do you know who your state senator is?
Yes.
And I think that helps to ground really early on the fact that it's through having that background, but then applying it, you can make a change when it comes to that stoplight, even though that stoplight is probably your city council person or somebody who is in your or your county supervisor, or local, right? And I come back to that as we're getting close to time, because I think that matters. But it's knowing that, so that you can be a part of those solutions as a community.
Yeah, and I think making the mistakes is one of the best ways to learn. If you don't mind sharing, I think this would be helpful to our audience. Was there a project or a person or something that, when you were presenting your programs, that just sort of crossed the lines when you were working, and you thought, "Gosh, this is not what we intended"? And how did you deal with that? What are sort of the goalposts or the guidelines as you do this work in developing what I'm hearing is like efficacious citizens? And for you, what are your personal goalposts as we, it works, but there's always something that goes awry. And I think when that happens, that's what creates panic, right? For our parents and people who want to make sure their kids aren't getting indoctrinated, as Ashley says.
Yeah, I can give an example. In addition to a curriculum that we have and we support teachers in implementing in their classroom, we do some direct youth work. So we have these youth advisory councils who are meeting with decision makers. So the Attorney General here in DC has a council that is advising, him on issues, because the juvenile justice system here is controlled by the Attorney General. So really having young people have a seat at the table as major decisions are being made. In Chicago, our youth council, who's thinking about safety and justice, had some concerns about a curfew that the then mayor had implemented, and for safety reasons said that young people couldn't be in certain areas of the city after a certain time. So really trying to implement this youth curfew. Young people were upset about it, and really were concerned that that they couldn't socialize in the way they wanted to, and so they wanted to demonstrate, in that area, like, we're going to show up at the time that we're not supposed to be there, and we're going to talk and ask people. And the demonstration was more asking people, downtown, do you think it's fair that there should be a curfew? Do you think it's fair? Do you think it's fair? So I got a call from our mayor's office. I have a friend in the mayor's office, and the question was, why didn't you call us? Why didn't you ask us directly to sit down with the mayor and have a conversation, or sit down with me and have a conversation? Why did you go directly to that type of action? When we're available, we could have the conversation. And the person said, I could see if we didn't have the conversation, then you could take the action that you took. And so in that, we in our curriculum, we look at sort of the steps that you take. It could be a letter to the editor, an op-ed because you're concerned about an issue. It could be writing your city councilman, writing to the mayor. It could be inviting that person to a forum. There are multiple steps of action that go, from, very beginning communication to, demonstration. And the person said, I just feel like with the relationship we have, there were some steps missed. And we acknowledged that. And we were like, actually, you were right. You called my cell phone, just like, we could have called your cell phone to say, here's a way that your young people could be heard. And that was a misstep on our part. And we owned it, and, created a conversation later on, with that staffer and our young people, so that their concerns about the curfew could be voiced.
That's really helpful, because I think people are worried that things will escalate, right, in a manner, and that perhaps is, that's not your intention, but there's oftentimes avenues that young people and adults can use to be active citizens. Chris, do you have anything to add?
I can probably come and think of many examples, both that have been more successful and maybe less successful. I come back to this. I think one of the key points that I want to emphasize when it comes to thinking about this topic is that many of us who have gotten into this space, no matter where we got into it knowing that we're not going to have easy conversations. This isn't the easy space. We could be teaching other things that probably would not make this as interesting and or dynamic as this space can be. But what does that make me think of? And actually dovetailing with what Vernay said, it is, because it's not easy, that much more important, if we're going to be in uncomfortable spaces, having uncomfortable conversations, to have practice doing that. And to know when things may, through experience, because of our own experience, know when things may be going in a certain direction that is too far, or we need to, as the instructor, teacher, professor, etc., bring things in a particular direction. That is part of the role. And I think I have seen so many talented folks in so many difficult situations and difficult conversations do that. And that comes with practice. It comes with teacher training. It comes with more practice. It comes with more experience, knowing when something is going in a direction or not. But I think it takes a term that I said earlier, intellectual humility. Which is not an easy thing to do, as we've talked about, especially if we have to be the ones that center a particular situation. But it is the space that we've all gotten into, and I think it's something that we are all continually practicing and learning ourselves as we engage in the essentially this particularly important part of what it means to be in a democratic republic.
I think that's a great transition to, unfortunately, what will be our last question, because we are close on time here. But, how will you help people feel comfortable with their role as educators? And I use the term educators loosely. How are you going to give them some last advice here to feel comfortable in creating engaged and efficacious citizens? Ashley.
I would just repeat what Vernay and Chris have said. It comes with practice. These are learned behaviors. The things that make democracy so precious are predicated on learned behaviors. It's not just the knowledge, it's not just the skills, it's the practice of disagreeing with respect, of negotiating, of compromising. I think of my hero in this space is Bill Galston, who wrote about, many, many times on the learned behavior that is required of citizens. So that would be my advice. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to practice. All of us are learning.
I want us to also be careful that we are not making teachers out to be, the bad guys, that we're also looking as a country as what is the role that everyone else plays in building civic leaders. It's not just the responsibility of schools. And if parents are not happy with what's happening at schools, how are parents collaborating with, talking with, connecting with, instead of pointing fingers? And so how are we creating these spaces that young people feel safe, that teachers feel safe? Because we are losing teachers, particular teachers in social studies and civics, because it's just easier to stay out of, charged areas. Also, what spaces are we, how are we charging policymakers and elected officials to be listening to young people? We're making all kinds of decisions about young people without talking, to them. As we were talking about just that last example about demonstration, Martin Luther King Jr. said, riot is the language of the unheard. When you get to the point that you are demonstrating, it is because you've tried over and over and over and over again, and no one has listened and no one has heard from you. And so you feel like in many ways that's the last resort. So I think some of the fears about young people going so far or teachers going off the rails, it really gets back to how hard are we listening? How hard are we protecting? How hard are we providing these safe spaces and these opportunities to provide support, to listen, to engage? Again, in ways that help students feel heard and respected and valued, teachers feel heard and respected and valued, because at the end of the day, that's what we all want, is to be heard, respected, seen, valued, in this country. So that's just sort of my closing thoughts, is that we're putting a lot of emphasis on what teachers should do for people who are already feeling all kinds of pressure. I want us to think about, as we educate our young people, whether it's in after school spaces or, whatever the role that we as, parents play, we as educators play, we as electeds play, how are we working more collaboratively together and listening and talking across difference?
In an amazing way, to echo what's been said, I think one of the things that comes to the front of my mind is that as important as it is to be doing this practice in classrooms, this happens, as Vernay held up her phone outside of the classroom. This happens at kitchen tables. This happens in communities. This happens with folks that have long graduated from formal education institutions. Why? Because this is the practice of what it means to be a part of a society.
Yep.
So it's going to happen, and we're going to have uncomfortable conversations in all of those spaces. And I think one of the things that I hope is one of the bigger takeaways that we've talked about here is that that's okay. It takes learning, it takes listening, it takes a willingness to listen. And I close with noting that that's exactly what was noted many, many, many years ago by folks about our society. And as we approach the 250th anniversary of this experiment, if we want to have another 250 years, it becomes important to recall and remember that this is a piece of the puzzle and that we have to continually be a part of that practice for it to continue going into the future.
Well, thank you so much, Ashley, Renee, and Chris, for sharing your expertise. I really look at this and I hear what you're saying about practice, and I think about whatever the laboratory component for chemistry is for civics, right? Needs to happen in a more robust manner so that our young people have the practice of democratic citizenship and can be even more efficacious adults. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. And I hope your Civic Learning Week has been as enjoyable and as informative as mine has been.